So when I was recording drums years and years ago, and I knew way less than I know now, which is still not a lot at all, I asked a music mentor of mine to put the following three things in order of importance. So I'm going to ask you the same question. The drummer, the drum kit, and the gear, mics and pre's.
Yeah, that's the way I put it.
You would put it in that order? So the drummer, most important, drum kit. Okay, I spoiled that part. Yeah. I should have mixed it up. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.
No, I mean, I think number one, the drummer's the most important thing.
Yeah.
You can have all the gear in the world, but if the drummer can't play and doesn't know actually how to make drums sound good, you're screwed. Or if he's really unbalanced and he's like smashing away on one thing and not on another, you're screwed. I think mics are incredibly important. It's genre specific, I think. You know, if you're trying to make something sound like a Mac DeMarco record or like a sludgy fuzz record, you know, you could probably get away with a bunch of 58s and you'd be laughing.
Yeah, it's true.
But if you're trying to do something that's a little bit more impressive than that, then the gear works. Like in a certain respect, like I almost feel like they're all equally important.
Yeah, totally.
You know, but I think if I were to actually put the weight up and say, listen, Mike, like you might not be able to use your Neumanns on this session, but the drummer's going to be killer. Yeah, I'd be like, oh, killer drummer.
Yeah,
cool.
Totally. No, yeah, it's a good point because I think a great drummer could sit down in a Toys R Us kit and play something awesome.
Great.
Yeah.
And I definitely 100% think that's true.
Yeah. One of the things I've been thinking about with tracking is that there's so many online tutorials about mixing. There's so many conversations that happen online, and a lot of people are obsessed with that mixing because it's something that you do on your own. A lot of people who are home studio enthusiasts, we mix in our bedrooms or in our basements, and we mix so long. And so there's a lot of content out there about mixing, plugins and whatnot. But there's also this mantra of like, don't try to fix it in the mix and try to get it right at the source.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I don't feel like there's a lot of content about tracking. I don't feel like there's a lot of people talking about tracking. And as I was saying earlier, I feel like there's times when I've taken the time to set up mics on a drum kit or set up mics on an amp, check for phasing, pick the right mics, pick the right pre's, get the levels right. All of a sudden I realize the mixing stage is so much easier.
I agree, yeah.
You know? So I really want to talk today about tracking, you have so much experience recording organic instruments and recording drums specifically. So I want to talk about drums, and I want to ask you some real specific questions about recording drums.
Sounds fun.
Is that cool?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is your kind of initial prep when you know a drummer's coming in here? And let's say, just for the sake of argument, let's say that we're talking today about pop rock drums in general. Okay. Not jazz, not, folk. Let's just say like the average drum kit.
Okay.
Where do you start mentally?
Well, I work in a fairly small room, and it obviously has been acoustically treated, more so on the mixing side. So when I track drums in this room, I tend to gobo off the drums quite a bit. I try to deaden the area that the drums are recording in, to avoid any kind of phase node problems, or avoid any kind of like early reflections that might be causing problems in the microphones or cause uneven frequency distribution of drums. I try to control that as much as I can, and I tend to be a little bit more heavy-handed with that, particularly with the walls that are directly around the drums. Okay, that's cool. I'm also a big fan of working, like I do a lot of records where I'm working electronically as well as digitally, and I find that, basically most samples are pretty dead sounding, and any kind of life that's given to them is done in post. So I usually want to have that option as well, and I'm also just a big fan of dub record drums, and I'm also a big fan of Motown drums. And cool. So, but you could put that into a modern rock context and talk about like Arctic Monkeys or Black Keys or a lot of things like that have more tighter St. Vincent, tighter, punchier drum sounds. So I start with making sure that I'm treating the room, and I'm sort of shaping around the drums and sort of deadening things as much as I can to make sure that I don't have any problems. Okay, that's cool. And so do you start off when you're tracking drums with a sound in mind that it's like, for this record, I want it to be a tight sound, or I want it to be a big,
Bonham sound. You start off with that, or do you just try to get a basic?
No, I do.
drum sound?
I think I definitely do. But again, even if I'm doing those things, I always make sure that the mics that the walls that are directly close to the drums are dead, and then I'll use the rest of the room. You can't see this on the camera, but this is a longer room, so I'll be grabbing a lot of that depth and those types of sounds on the room mics as things come down the the length of the room, or it'll be done with reverbs and stuff. Right.
How important is the room? Because we talked last time we were here and on our video that you had never really planned to do drums in here.
Yes. Here's the thing. So lots of records were made in a lot of different rooms, and I think there's certain things that you can do in a smaller room that you can't do in a big room, and there's certain things you can do in a big room that you can't, vice versa. Yeah. Like, if you want things to sort of sound like, a Rage Against the Machine record or a Tom Petty record and kind of have that really natural big sound, you need to be in a very treated commercial studio. That's what that sound is.
Right.
I fake that sort of thing now because I have a Bricasti and it allows me to do that. But at the end of the day, if you really want it to sound like that sort of Tom Petty way, you're dealing with a pretty masterful engineer working in a great room.
In a great room, yeah.
And a great drummer.
Yeah.
More so, actually.
I recorded drums in my attic, which is really, really dead attic. And I found that it was a little, I do love a dead sound. I love a really tight drum kit, but I felt like I got things a little too choked. I don't know what I did wrong.
Yeah, but that can also be microphones. So, okay, we'll go through all these things.
Yeah.
So, let's go, actually, I was just going to say, let's go back. So you were sort of asking about how important the room is. So I think, obviously it serves its purpose in any way, but I think the most important thing with a room isn't so much, you have to be more concerned with your room treatment when you're in a smaller room.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Right? Because you have more, the tighter that things are, the faster your reflections are.
Right.
Which means that you are going to be dealing with more problems regarding phase cancellation. And you're also going to be dealing with, really quick slapback on those early reflections. And if those are causing any kind of phase problems within the mic as that hits, it's going to make things sound bad.
Yeah.
It's just going to be bad. So you don't have as much room to be creative with your miking. No, that's not true. You don't have as much room to be creative with your miking insofar as I want this to be a bigger drum sound, so I can just move my mics away and then strip everything back. It's you'll have a bigger sound, but the sounds will be worse. So my point of view is to always make sure that there's no phase problems or early reflection problems dealing with the close mics.
Okay.
Specifically. So I tend to deaden things around it. Now, if you're in a bigger room that isn't perfectly symmetrical like this room is, your problems aren't as big because the sound waves are going to be bouncing all over the place, and you're getting a more natural wash of the reverb within the room, as opposed to just getting things just bouncing back really quick. And I mean, this type of stuff is, you can look online and you can actually see the physics of this. How there is actually a thing, if the wall is under this distance, you're going to end up with direct phase problems.
Really?
Yeah, because you're going to hit a snare drum. Let's say the mic's right here. You're going to hit a snare drum, and the time that it takes one wave to hit this wall and come back versus the time it takes for that sound to actually hit that mic, they're now interfering with each other.
Okay.
So my take on this is just fucking deaden it.
Right. Okay, I was going to ask you. So if you're in a bedroom, you have no choice.
I don't think you have a choice. Unless you're using... You have to deaden things,
right?
But you can also. I think that you're extremely limited with your microphone selection in that type of situation.
That's
because
true. Yeah.
If you use a condenser, particularly a more open sounding condenser, all you're going to get is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Well, let's talk about the actual on the drum mics.
Okay.
So let's start with the snare. So what do you do on top of the snare?
I tend to use a 57.
Okay.
If
you use more than one?
Yeah, increasingly I'm using a bottom mic, and I find that it helps.
Okay.
I don't think it's essential. I think you can kind of use distortion and other techniques in order to kind of get a bit of crunch in there. But I do use it increasingly, and I think it helps sort of the snare drum to sound a little less, like you use the word choked, but kind of like choke sounding if it's in a deader room, because now you're creating a more 3D sounding image with your close mics.
What are you using on the bottom? Generally?
I usually use a 57 or 58, just something like that. I don't mess around with a lot of that stuff too much. I find 57s are just great on drums. So there might be things that are a little bit better or worse or whatever, but I just don't.
Do you use a second one on top?
I have. I have used like a pencil condenser. I've sort of tried that type of thing out, and I know it works for a lot of people, but anytime I've used it, particularly if the drummer is playing cymbals at the same time that they're recording the drums, I find that it just sort of washes things out. I've had a lot of success using an 87 on a snare, and I think it sounds amazing, but a lot of the times that I've done that, we've been building loops and whatnot. But it is a beautiful open sound. But if you're dealing with a rock drummer or whatever that's sort of smashing away on things, it becomes, I couldn't count on that. Yeah.
Well, it's funny, actually. I saw these guys using a 414 on the top with a 57, and so I had tried it, and it's cool when you're testing it. It definitely gives you that low end, but not when the whole kit is being played.
No, I find that it doesn't work like as well as like it does on like a guitar amp, like multiple mics. I mean. That I really do believe in, but like on drums, just the top and the bottom.
They're just such a unique instrument that there's so much else going on, so many frequencies coming from everywhere, and so many mics. Okay, so that's your snare. Do you do a hi-hat mic?
Rarely.
Yeah. Is it just depend on the track or?
Yeah. And it's I find them very difficult to deal with. I find that hi-hats are usually a problem to begin with.
Talk to me about the kick drum.
Yeah. So again, I'm a big fan of the D12. I've always found that it's given me what I wanted, whether I was recording jazz or whether I was recording something that's like a heavier genre.
What is the difference between a D12 and a D112, if you can?
Well, I mean, I'm not totally sure. I mean, as far as like sonically, no, they're hard to find. But as far as I know sonically, it's just that the D12 to me has a much sort of it definitely softens the transients in a way that I really like. It's not too clicky, and if I want clicky, I've always found that I can just boost up the top end of it or add a sample. But the nuts and bolts of it really give me like a pretty thick, pillowy, but not pillowy in a muddy way, just like a medicine ball sort of sound. Like it's like a sort of sound that I really like, and I never think a lot about it.
Yeah, that's cool. Where do you put it?
Yeah, this is interesting, I think, because I always tend to aim it down a little bit. And the reason I do that is because I don't tend to want too much attack. So having your diaphragm angled down a little bit helps the sound wave not hit the diaphragm at a 90-degree angle like that, like where it's perpendicular. It just sort of it's just a softer blow to it.
Interesting. They kind of say that they suggest that about vocals too, with vocal mics too.
That's the same. That'll help with plosions and all that kind of shit.
Is it inside the kit?
Yeah, that's inside the kit. And I tend to, if you were to say where the beater hits versus the shell, I'm probably about a third. In 2/3 away from the.
Interesting.
And another important thing I think is that when you are using a sound hole, sometimes people will actually put their mic right in the sound hole, just at the sound hole. And that's the last thing you want to do.
Right. Why is that?
Because of turbulence. So you want it in the mic, so you're primarily just catching the direct sound wave off of the skin of the batter side. But if you put it just at the end there, you're getting the culmination of all that air trying to rush out of that sound hole. So you're gonna get more low end, but it's gonna be an undefined shitty low end. So you never ever want to do that. And again, it's just turbulence. You're getting all that air that's just fighting to get out of the drum, as opposed to just getting that natural sound wave off of the batter head.
Cool. Nice.
And then I'll usually use like an NS10
Sub kick.
Sub kick.
Okay, cool.
And then fucking put it wherever.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, you'll figure that out later.
So I think the common mic, you talk about your mic inside and then the sub kick, and I've made a DIY sub kick, and it's just brilliant. It's a $1 speaker, and it's I don't have an NS10, but like it's just a speaker, and it's so surprising at what it can do for you.
Yeah, I tried to use
a
1,000 things. I've tried to use 808s underneath. I've tried to use things like Waves R bass, and every time I've used that, it's just never really been right. I've never been able to sort of synthesize low end in a way that I find particularly interesting. Yeah, the woofer is great.
What about a condenser outside of the kick?
You could but it's got to be great.
Yeah, a good condenser?
Yeah, it's got, I find that if you just use any condenser, you're just sort of getting a pretty, you're not really getting the characteristics of the resonant skin that you want. I find that you're just sort of getting like a papery, shitty sort of weird low end. Yeah. But I don't own a FET 47, but I've used a FET 47 several times on the outside skin, and then all of a sudden it makes sense. Right. But with that said, I don't think that I would rather use that over just a woofer.
Interesting. Well, that's cool. Now, what about toms?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of options for toms.
I think toms, sorry to interrupt, I think toms is the hardest for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think so.
I know for me, I think anyone who's recording drums for the first time, it's because when you envision a tom, you envision some of the great 70s and 80s toms, and it's just so hard to get that sound.
Yes, I agree. For me. They tend to not sound that great. A lot of that is in mixing.
Is it? Well, that's good to know.
I find that. I will juggle back and forth between using a 57 on a tom. You could use a 421 or whatever. I for me, it's just different degrees of mediocre. You never all of a sudden, if you use a 421 over a 57, I don't think you're ever going to go wow, everything I ever wanted out of this tom is happening. You know what I mean? It's just sort of oh, well, this one's got more of this. And so I just use 57s. And also, I mean, you're using it on the snare. So if it can't work on the snare, well, if it does work on the snare, I mean. If I'm not doing that, I do use pencil condensers. I'll use KM184s.
Oh, okay.
And that I do think is better in certain ways and more difficult in others. So the KM184 to me is a really natural sounding mic, and I find that it does a great job of representing a tom for a close mic. But on the negative side of that is that you do get more bleed. So if you do have a really even tempered drummer that's really great, go nuts with that. Right. I think you'll be really happy. But otherwise, I would use a 57. And I would also say is that if I do sample replace anything a lot, it's toms.
Is it? Yeah. Well, the thing is, when I was recording drums for my record recently, we didn't have a lot of inputs. We were working with maybe 10, I think. And, I don't love toms. My music is folk music doesn't have a lot of toms in it. And I remember thinking, I don't want to give a whole input to the occasional hit.
Yeah, sure.
Twice a song. So yeah, it is kind of, samples may work. Because you end up looking in Pro Tools and it's one hit here.
Yeah, one hit. Yeah, sure. Yeah. And do you even need to hear them?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. I get that. I mean, the other thing too is that there's been records where I haven't even really needed to use the closed mics. On the toms specifically.
The overheads,
the overheads do such a great job.
Oh, that's cool.
And depending on the overheads that you use will be different. So
do you mic underneath the tom?
I've never done that.
No way.
But to be honest with you, I think it's just my version of I only got so many inputs. The last thing I'm going to do is put them.
I know. Well, I was just editing a thing from Jukasa, and Darren says that it was his holy shit moment when he put a 57 underneath the floor tom. It was finally everything came together for him. Well, so I want to try it.
Now I'm curious.
Yeah.
But I've also here's a weird one is that I have a friend of mine who swears by doing the sub kick thing on toms.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? So he'll actually just sort of cradle, he uses smaller woofers.
Okay.
So off of a 5-inch, it's a 5-inch driver, and he'll put that under each one of the toms. Oh, and nice. He says between the two of them, he gets that immediate attack off the top guy, and then actually gets the sort of the doof sound out of the.
Cool. Well, and I think the biggest time where I'm really concerned about is on those tracks where they're kind of riding the tom. That's where I think it's like I always feel like I'm falling short is on a song where the tom is really prominent.
I mean, you can do all these things, but I'm also the type of person that believes that, at a certain point, like, if you got two toms, or even, if you got a floor and a rack, like, you're adding another microphone off of each one of these things that needs to be in proper phase with everything else.
Yeah.
And that is a whole other headache. So, but anyway, Darren knows what he's doing, but and he's had that eureka moment, but that just makes me nervous.
You don't want to try it?
No, I just I don't need another two mics to make sure that it's like everything's great. And then I bring up the bottom mics and all of a sudden every time a cymbal hit happens, it's like out of phase with the six other microphones that are within 3 feet of it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like that's a big issue is you're putting a lot of microphones very close to things, and when you're within 3 feet of something, that tends to be like your danger zone of phase.
Talk to me about overheads.
So it really depends on the room that you're in, and I think mic choice is very, very important in that, and I think genre is more like I don't really change the close mics ever, but I will always change overheads and room mics.
Oh, really?
Because that's, in my mind, that's sort of your bread and butter of what the drum sound really is.
Cool.
Even a lot of people, if they like, this is one of the things with tight miking and using a tighter room is that like you think that you can rely on the close mics, but like a drum sound is the drum sound in the room.
Right.
And if you're only catching that split second of the transient, you're not it'll sound dinky.
Yeah.
So much of the sound is from it resonating and reflecting in the room.
In the same way that two ears hear it standing in front.
Sure, stereo image, right? Like that's the thing. And that those little bits of delay. Like it's interesting to sort of talk so negatively about phase and early reflections in one respect, but then when it actually comes down to drums, having subtle delays between the different mic placements is what gives you space.
Awesome. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So on the one hand, it's
point.
like, no, I sweat over it and I make sure that nothing's fucking with that. But then when it actually comes down to the room mics, you do want that.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's what gives you the proper image. That's what gives you interesting.
Makes it feel natural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Drum overheads, I tend to work with 4 microphones.
Okay.
That I'll choose. It's usually either a pair of Coles.
Okay.
It's either a pair of Cam 184s. I'll use 160s, Bayer Dynamic M160s, which are also ribbons, or I'll use 87s.
Okay.
I tend to lean towards using the KM 184s if I want things to be a little more snappier and be a little bit more in that sort of like more commercial sound.
Right.
And if I want things to be a little bit sexier and a little bit smoother and a little more interesting, then I'll work with the Coles.
Yeah, that's cool.
And then I find that those other 2 mics just kind of vary. Like the 160, one of the things that's nice about that is that on a more commercial sounding record, I don't think that I would work with that as much. But in certain situations where you're limited on your mics, I think that I would rather have a M160 as the overhead or M160s as the overhead as opposed to the Coles. And for me, the personal reason for that is that it just does a great job of softening the high end. And it also does a great job of bringing out the toms and the snares in a really just sort of natural way. Like it really adds, like there's just something about the way that a ribbon responds to a transient that's a little slower, it's a little sludgier.
Right.
And in particular, the KM184, I find that like low mids and the mids just, it just does something where it almost sounds like you extended the release time on a compressor in a way, like it just sort of doof, as opposed to just being doof, you know what I mean? Like it really kind of adds to that.
Yeah. So you're getting the overheads pretty close to what you like a drum sound to sound like? Is that
I try to as much as I can.
And what do you do? Compression or EQ on them?
Always, yeah.
Yeah.
Always.
What do you put your room or your overheads through?
I will usually not worry about the EQ as much.
Okay.
Because I find that I'm generally using the microphone for that.
Yeah, right.
And if I want the sound to be a little bit darker, then I'll use the Coles. And if I want them to be brighter and more lively, then I'll be using the 184s. But regardless of that, I always compress them. And for the overheads, I tend to either use my Alicia Expressor or I use my SSLG.
Okay.
And because they're both kind of punchy and I can really control the grab.
Yeah.
If I had a pair of distressors, I'd probably do the same thing. They sort of have that same characteristic.
Right. I had a kind of my own aha moment when I was mixing overheads the other day, and somebody had mentioned on a video I was watching about getting the overheads to sound like a drum kit that you wanted, and then everything else just sort of bringing into it. Whereas a lot of people also talk about significantly high passing the overheads. For me, if I'm mixing the overheads, I may be high passing a little bit, but I'm also kind of boosting a little bit of the low end and trying to get that kick sounding beefy, the snare sounding beefy. So I don't want to talk too much about the mixing process, but what do you do with
But I rely on the room mics more for that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like I do ultimately tend to high pass a little bit.
Okay.
And I'm really just sort of, I'm trying to get some punch out of them, but I would say that the room mics that are in front of the kit, I rely on more heavily
for that
type of image.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
As far as room mics go, I've never used the cam. I don't like small diaphragm condensers for rooms.
Okay. Yeah.
I find they're just a little bit like, it's great as an overhead because you can kind of bring life to things in the cymbals. But I find that the room mics are the thing that are, it's you're in between the close mics and the actual reverb that you're going to be using. Yeah. Or if you're in a decent enough room, that it actually really is your drums.
Nice. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's where the decay is. So, when you think about the way that a drum hit happens in time and what the listener is listening to, the close mics are only grabbing that person's attention for a split second.
Right.
But much more of the actual drum sound is the room or is the reverb.
Totally.
So they're, in my mind, a little bit more important. And I'll usually use, in that case, an 87 or 87s.
Okay.
And then, but more often than not, I'll use the Coles there. And I would rather have the Coles than anyone
stereo?
Yeah. I find drum, like I try to get into the mono drum thing. And I don't mind it as an overhead. I've tracked sessions where I'll just use a mono 87 or a mono M160, and they're okay. But I just find like without space, I find so many of the frequencies just tending to bunch up on each other. So like I kind of like, certain mics are doing one thing and then all of a sudden you have your stereo spread of your room and you can just listen to those frequencies just kind of like move around a little bit. Yeah. And I find that to be a more interesting thing. And I'll do the same because I'm in a tighter room. Again, I'll usually use the Blum, whatever the hell it's called. And
we'll overdub with what the
if you can get somebody else to scrape blah blah blah. That'd be great. Again, I'm in a tighter room. So my reasoning behind that is that space pair can work great. I find in this room in particular, or just actually in general, like if I'm doing space pair, a pair of 87s is awesome.
Oh, okay.
I really, really like those as room mics. Like Kathleen Monroe's record, I had 287s rolling on that. And to be honest, most of the drum sound was that.
Wow.
Because it just allowed everything to sound kind of like the drums needed to sit behind the mix a little bit and do it in a really natural way. And I just found I could bring those up and that's where it was placed. And then if I wanted the snare to peek through a little bit more, I would just sort of bring it in. But that was a very, I spent a lot of time thinking about the engineering on that. And when I got to mixing, it was just easy. Yeah. So
there's something about taking pride in the fact that you're recording acoustic drums and you're doing it.
It takes a lot of work. It's a hard instrument.
It is totally, yeah.
I mean, it's probably the hardest. So, but because of the closer room, closer walls, we're only looking at about 12 feet wide here on this part of the room. This is more. But, the benefit of doing, let's just call it XY for now.
Okay, sure.
So if you're
this is where you have a mono mic and then another one facing out?
No. So Blumlin or whatever is taking a figure 8 microphone and placing them on top of each other.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So this one is spreading this way, this one's spreading that way. Oh. And then this one's doing the exact same this way. And then it basically creates like a stereo omni.
Oh, okay.
Because you're picking up all around those two mics. Okay. But then you pan them hard left and right, and then it just sort of opens up. The benefit of that in a room like this is that I get them away from the walls.
Right.
And I prefer them to be as centered as possible so that if something does reflect off the wall into those mics, it's not like I've just found that I got a much more consistent representation of the mic in each mic. Whereas when I was doing the space pair, I'd find like something in the room caused the low end to be different in this mic than this one.
Right.
Or the high end was a little bit different. Like something was going on with the way that the reflections were happening in the room.
We're talking about overheads. We're talking about rooms. The last mic I wanted to ask about was like trash mics or these like alternative mics. Did you do anything like that?
Yeah, often I'll add something in the mix. There's two types of things that I'll usually do. There'll usually be one mic that'll be either distorted some way. Often it'll be a 58 or something. Maybe it'll be the M160. Cool. But the 58 came from doing so many live sessions in the room, and then like doing guide vocals or whatever, and you bring up that mic and you're just like, fuck, man, that sounds great. So then I just started saying, well, why don't I just use it purposefully? So I'll sometimes sort of point it right at the drums, but there's other times where I'm just happy to have it wherever.
That's cool.
If it is sort of like your drum smash mic, I kind of do like the Distressor 1176, all buttons in, nuke mode, British nuke or whatever. We touched on this last time, but those ARC preamps, distorting those like crazy, cool. I think is awesome. Yeah. And sometimes you just sneak that into a mix and it sounds great. Recently I used, I did this in mixing, but I used Fairfield Circuitry Unpleasant Surprise on the I had like a sort of single front of kit mic, and I just sort of ran it through that, and it was it's like a fuzz factory type of thing. Yeah, just fucks with it. And
so will you try that in tracking next?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you know what I mean? Cool. Like if I'm sort of thinking that's in the mix, and then I think I stereoized it, so I just sort of I put it in stereo and then delayed one.
And that sounded really cool. Those are creative things that.
Those are great. I mean, if you only have a mono room mic, there's nothing wrong with faking it, I mean, or putting it through like a subtle chorus or something like that, just to sort of make it sound a little wider. Yeah, no, that's really cool. Otherwise, I find it's weird because it's like like if you just do mono, it's like it's sort of like so natural and just there, but like I find that because it is what it is. You bring up those faders, so that's natural because that's what you did. Yeah. But I find as far as the human listening experience, it's not at all. Right. Like you never listen to a drum like this. Yeah. You know what I mean? You have two ears. So for things not to be subtly modulating or reflecting a little bit more differently, I find it to be a very, surreal experience. I find it to be very unnatural and I don't quite like it. Yeah. Unless it's like, hard pan, like Beatles styles or something. The other thing you can do, and I suggest you do this with guitars as well, is if you take like a large diaphragm condenser and you actually just like literally face it to the wall, like 2 inches away from the wall. Okay. And all that away from the drums. You don't want it too far away from the drums because then you get like a noticeable pre-delay. Okay. You know what I mean? Yeah. Or it's so pre-delayed then it works. Yeah. You know what I mean? But in this room, I usually have it about 6 feet away from the room, from the kick.
On a hard surface?
It'll be usually right beside like one of those panels there. Cool. And I find that you bring that up and it actually sounds sort of like a mic in Omni in the room.
Have you ever heard about a condenser or a mic of any sort kind of over top of the kick or in around like the knees?
Yeah, and I've seen guys, I remember stepping in when the Arkells were recording with Joe Ciccarelli, and he had a 47 sitting there. Oh, okay. In Omni. And I just ordered a Flea 47. Oh, nice. I'm excited about that. So those
are beautiful.
They're great. Yeah, I sold the Lawson and got that.
Oh, cool. I saw you selling that.
Yeah. So it's gone. My beautiful gold.
The gold one. Oh, man.
It kind of hurts me.
What are the hip-hop guys going to do now?
I don't know. They're going to be lost. We're scared.
It's funny because everything, like you said, you're talking about the heavy-handed thing, but a lot of things we're talking about, somebody, the average person would come in here and go, I don't hear a difference. I don't hear a difference. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing I've taken away from some of these studio tours and chatting with guys like you is that it's the ears, it's the people's ears that have grown. And I've seen my ears grow over the past 2 years, the past year, where I'm just adding a little bit of saturation or just a subtle little boost at the top. And it's night and day for me. Yeah. Whereas some other people maybe can't hear it at all.
Yeah, I think it's like most things in life, like, that last 20% is actually like 80%. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Exactly. Like in when it comes down to the final product and differentiating between something that's done okay and something that's been done great. Yeah. Most people are doing the same shit. It's just the finessing over the smaller details and the sum of all those little fine details that will make things sound slick.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what separates when a lot of us amateur producers will look at pro engineers and pro producers and think, how do we get that sound? And really, it is the gear, and it is the the plugins or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's the brain and the ears of that producer.
Yeah, and how you use it.
Yeah.
And everybody gets results in different ways. I get it one way, and then somebody else will be like, I never do those things. This is the way I do it. And it's like, well, all the power to you, man. Everybody's doing their thing. So.
Yeah. Well, the depressing end to this conversation is today, as I was shaving, I was listening to a great new record I found on Pitchfork through the speakers of my iPhone that I dropped into a cup. So I apologize to that engineer.
I did the same thing.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Okay.
It's fun.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.